Hi, I'm Rob Cosman. Welcome to my shop away from home. We're in Niagara Falls, Ontario, Canada. This is our 9th Purple Heart Project class. That is something we do for combat wounded veterans to help them, particularly those guys that suffer from PTSD. Hand tool woodworking is very therapeutic. So we got a new technique on cutting dovetails that's helped some of them make fantastic dovetails first, second, or third try. So I'm going to go through this. I'm teaching it to them one last time. They're now viewing as from an experienced vantage point. So hopefully they're going to pick up on little details that they may not have seen before, and I'll share with you some of the new techniques that we have that make it really easy to duplicate. I need a really good pen if somebody can loan me one. I've got one here that doesn't work very well. Okay, thank you. Here, you can fight with this one. All right, I got two pieces, tailboard, pinboard. The tailboard's a little bit thinner than the pinboard. I'm going to do what we call a through dovetail. So the first thing I'm going to do is set the thickness of the pinboard with my marking gauge, and then take that measurement and scribe it all the way around the tailboard. If you've already seen several of my dovetail videos, this one is going to be different in certain parts that will make a difference for you. Now I'm going to measure the thickness of my tailboard, and I'll take that and I will transfer it to the two faces of the pinboard, not on the edges. Now, I'm going to take my tailboard over here to the bench. I'm going to set it up so that it's hanging just out beyond the edge of the bench, and I'm using my skew block plane, which I've got to get set up. I thought I had it. It's set up so that the edge of the blade is sticking just out beyond the edge of the plane. I'll advance it for a very light shaving. I'd rather take 2 or 3 light passes than one heavy one. It's got an adjustable fence on it, so I'm going to make it so that the fence is allowing the blade to cut right on that gauge line. And then I'm going to take 1, 2 passes, and that's enough. So those 2 passes are going to leave me with a little rabbet that I'll use to register this on top of the pinboard. Can I go ahead? All right. Take my tailboard and put it in the vise. I'm going to have it facing the audience so that they can follow along. I'm going to use 2 pair of dividers, and this is the reason why we have 2 pair of dividers. I haven't mentioned that earlier. First thing I'm going to do is establish my outside half pin, and that's going to be somewhere around 1/4 of an inch. So in from either end, I'll leave a little mark. In from this end, I'll leave the same little mark. Now I set that aside because I'll do another corner on this drawer or box, and that prevents me from having to switch around 1 pair of dividers. You'll see what I mean here shortly. I don't normally lay anything out at this stage because I may as well do it all in one. I'm going to divide this for 3 tails. So lightly at first, so as not to leave a whole bunch of holes in the end of my board. And when I cross the other half pin mark, which is right there, by the amount that I want my inside pins to be, I'll go ahead and now leave permanent marks. So there, there, then I'm going to come to this one and go back the other way, there and there. Now I'll take my pen, take my dovetail marker. I think I have to borrow someone's dovetail marker because I loaned mine out. Does anybody have one? Real handy. Thank you. I'm going to use a 1:6 ratio. So put the pen in the hole, move the gauge over to it, square across the end and up the face, go to the second one and do the same thing. Go to the third one. Sorry, fourth. Now I'm going to come back this way. Handy to have those little marks left by the divider because you can find them with the end of your pen or pencil. Slide the marker over to it and you get an accurate mark. Okay. Last step in the layout is to identify which side of this line I need to saw on. And I would do all of them. It's not worth screwing up and having to start over when you could have avoided it by doing that. Now, the only critical cut, and the nice thing about this new technique, that this procedure eliminates the need for 2 critical cuts. And if you're not sure what I'm talking about, let me explain. The cut across the end of the board must be absolutely perpendicular. And then on the pin board, we had to make perfect plumb cuts. But if we do this right, we can avoid having to worry about plumb cuts on that one, and I'll show you momentarily. So I'm going to lay my saw right against the line. Now I see all of the pen line. No wood between the blade and the mark, just the pen line, full width. Make my cut. Careful to stop at the baseline, but also careful to make it right to the baseline. Saves a lot of extra work when it comes time to having to clean out those corners. Literally a second of being careful to take the saw cut right to the baseline prevents having to go in with a chisel and do the same. Now I'll go the other way. Wipe the sawdust out of the teeth so that when you set the saw on the wood, you don't have a bunch of sawdust dropping on the line and obscuring it. Now, I'm going to take my chisel and just get rid of all that sawing or the fuzz from the saw. If you don't do this, then it makes it difficult for that little rabbet that we cut, that shoulder, to reference against the pin board. Take my plane. Now, just before I put the pin board in the vise, I'm going to use the side of my plane to measure the thickness of my saw kerf, which is measuring the saw plate and the set on both sides. Then I'll take my pin board, put it in the vise, make sure it's standing plumb and flush with the top of the plane. Set the plane back. I don't trust that entirely, so I'll actually go in here with my square, verify it. Now, very critical that the sides be square. Put this in place. Set the marking gauge so that the cutter is on top. We always measure from the same side. If one piece were to be thicker than the other, or wider than the other, it's going to throw this off. But if we measure from the same side, we're safe. Put the cutter on there. It's sitting on top. Slide the board over until it touches. That rabbet we cut has them lined up. Now I'm going to take my dovetail marking knife, and since I moved the tail board to my left, I'm going to go to the right side. And it sometimes helps to go in there and actually identify the tail. I'm going to put a T on there so you know which piece you're referring to. I move the tail board to the left. I'm going to go to the right side of each tail. I'm going to reach down with my knife and drag it through the end grain of the pin board. And then I'll go to the next tail, to the right side of it, and do the same thing. And the shape of this knife allows me to reach right in the back so I can get a real well-defined kerf. Now, before I move this is the new technique. Does anybody have that blue tape? Is it handy? Anybody know where it is? I'm going to take my dovetail saw and I'm going to reach down through. But sometimes it's hard to see that gauge line, especially as your eyes get a little bit older. So if I use some blue painter's tape, cut that off and put it right on that line, much easier to see. Now, a bit of gymnastics involved in this, but I'm going to reach with my saw, and you have to have a really, really light touch. I'm going to put the saw in the kerf, and I'm going to let the kerf guide the saw. And what I'm going to do, and I'm careful not to cross my gauge line up here on the tailboard, but I'm going to start that cut into the pin board. And if you're figuring out what's going on here, that's going to keep me, or that's going to start my saw cut when it comes time to cutting those pins, and it's going to ensure that I get perpendicular, or in this case, plumb cuts. It also saves me from having to mark them out, which I used to do. Now, tailboard has to go to the opposite side. So what I'll do is I'll move it over, put the cutter of the marking gauge up underneath, and then slide it back. Don't want that in my way. Slide it back until it makes contact with the side of the pin board. Now I have offset my tailboard to the right So I'm going to go to the left side of the tails. One marked with a T, and I'm going to reach down there. When you're doing this, make sure that if you drag the sawtooth blade through like that, you're probably going to pick a piece of wood off. So after you've put it down, then lay it flat and drag it through so all the teeth are engaged in the wood, and it, for some reason, doesn't tend to pull big chunks of wood out. 3 or 4 passes. The deeper that kerf mark is in the pin board, the easier it is for the saw to follow. Now, again, with everything still in place, I can't emphasize enough how careful you have to be in doing this. You literally have to just support the saw from falling on the ground and nothing else. That kerf in the tailboard has to guide the saw while it cuts down into the pin board and starts that plumb cut for you. Just like that. Now I can take this piece off, set it aside. I'm going to leave that tape on there just to make it easier to see. And I raised this board up for the simple reason that it's a little bit easier now for me to get in here, drop that saw down into the kerf. Another one of those situations where you have to have a really light touch. Cut down to the line. Let the saw kerf that you started guide the rest of the saw. Now, this is why it's so important that that cut across the end of the tailboard be perpendicular. If you didn't do it, if it wasn't perpendicular, this wouldn't work because it would have these cuts sloping to the left or to the right. And if that happens, you're going to end up with a pin that is either wider at the bottom or narrower at the bottom. One causes pressure to build and a split, and the other is going to leave a gap. Don't want either one. Okay, as soon as we're done that, if you want, you can come in here and identify which part is waste. I'm going to drop that back down just because it's nice when it's solidly held. With my fret saw, I'll drop down to the bottom, come just off the bottom. Saw as close to that line as possible. It just simply removes or reduces the amount of chiseling I have to do. Drop down, raise up a little bit. That off. Okay, we'll chisel that, but before we do, we'll go in and process this piece. By the way, another nice reason or an advantage of this technique is if I had screwed up on that tailboard, I still have my pin board intact, and I could go ahead and process another one from it without having to redo the tails. But I'm pretty sure that's going to work, so I'm not worrying about it. Drop down to the bottom, saw close to the line. Careful not to hit the tail as you exit the other side. Lay this on its side. Now what I do here is I eyeball against this inlay, and that tells me that that board is now level. I'll come in with a chisel. I usually make a nice deep cut right here, and from the waist side of what would be the half pin, I can remove that little bit of wood. Now when I lay my saw in there, I can tell because there's a shoulder for the saw to go against. And you can tell if you're off because there's going to be a gap. So get it so there's no gap. Now, one of 2 tasks is completed. Second task is making a plumb cut, following the line all the way to the bottom. But the task of having to make sure it's square is pretty much done for you. Eyeball that so it's standing level. Reach in there, remove that waste. Set the saw in, move it over to the gap closes. And chop. All right, now we just got to remove a bit of waste. I'm going to use a 1/4-inch chisel, starting on the inside. Lay it right up against that shoulder that we cut with the skew block plane. Go down about halfway. Now that shoulder allows me to chop regardless of the amount of waste ahead of the chisel, because the shoulder supports the chisel. On this side, I don't have that, so if there was too much material there, rather than allow it to push the chisel back behind my gauge line, I would remove some of the waste with a preliminary chop. But I got really close on this one, so I don't have to do that. I like a really well-defined marking gauge line so that the chisel falls into it and you know exactly where it is. It locks it in place and it just works so much better. Now working front to back with the choking up with the chisel so as not to stick it into my hand farther than I care to. I'm going to make sure that these corners are nice and clean. Now this was the reason why I suggested that if you saw right to the line, then there's not a lot of work to be done here. Now I managed to screw up one or two of them. That's why I'm having to go back in and do this work. Make sure these corners are clean. The safer way to do it, of course, is to have two hands behind the chisel. And it's a little more convenient when the board is being held in the vise. I want to make sure there's no wood on top of the gauge line. If you have wood on top of the gauge line, when you put your joint together, that is going to push the joint apart, and that's where you're going to end up with gaps at the base of those pins, and you do not want that. Final step with the tailboard. I'm going to come in here and I'm going to cut little chamfers. Again, I'm choking up the chisel to be careful. Start in about a 1/16 and go right to the bottom. This will allow the joint to go together more easily, and it will also prevent the glue from getting shoved to the bottom of the joint. Okay, next time we touch that, it'll involve glue. Now our tailboard. Our pin board, starting on the inside, a little wider chisel. We always want to hold the chisel so that we can see plumb. Put that in the gauge line. And I like to lean back a little bit so I can follow the slope of the pin. That'll become a little more apparent when we do the other side. And if you'll notice, I support the chisel with my thumb from my right hand. It's anchored to the board so that I have lots of control. And I just drag it over until I feel it drop into the gauge line. And I like to keep some downward pressure on the chisel tip with my left hand, and that prevents it from bouncing out. I've had that happen before. You're pounding away and it bounces, and next thing you know, it's coming down somewhere else on your board. So if you keep some downward pressure, it allows for a lot more control. Okay, put this in the vise. We're just a minute or two away from being done. I'm going to grab a narrower chisel. Make sure these corners are clean. Now, if you followed the slope accurately, then a lot of this work is already done. So I have a little to remove there. This is really soft pine. I want to make sure there's no bumps in the middle, so I'm going to come inside here by about a 1/16, meaning I'm going to stay away from the actual outside edge. And I'll just get rid of any stuff that may have bounced back from when the chisel was cutting it. If you don't get rid of any of these bumps, then they will prevent the joint from closing and it won't look very good. Okay, a little bit of glue. I need my steel hammer. It's always nice to have a block to pound this together with. So I can use that one. You guys following along? Learn anything new?
Yes.
Good. That's what I was waiting to hear. Okay, we only glue the long grain sides, but we glue the long grain sides of both tails and pins. It actually works as a bit of a lubricant in getting the joint together. That doesn't last very long though, because instantly the wood starts to absorb the moisture from the glue, so you've got to be fairly quick. Make sure you have all your tools handy that you're going to need. And I just said we don't put any on the end grain, but I do put a little bit on those outside shoulders. That firmly held in the vise. Put this in position. I like to start it by hand. Now I prefer to tap it together with a block so the entire joint goes together at the same time. Wipe off any of the excess glue. Make sure it's closed down here. Make sure it's square. Put it in the vise. And normally I guess we would wait for the glue to dry, but that would make the video too long. So we'll clean this up. Always clean up the ends of your tails or pins that are sticking proud with little short strokes before you go the whole way. If not, then they hold the plane up and you start taking material off there and you introduce a taper. Don't want that. Okay, that's clean. Flip that over. This piece was a little uneven in its thickness. It was thicker on one side than the other, so I'll start on the heavy side. And I just need the plane until I get rid of the pen marks. Okay. Now we'll flush up the edges. Now, let's have a quick look at it before we pass it around. So there's what you go. Nice sharp corners on both sides. That's what I like. Nice straight lines meeting on a sharp corner. That technique gives you perfectly plumb cuts. It literally eliminates the need to have to be able to make a plumb cut by feel or by trying to follow the line. So that new technique, if you employ it, should give you perfect dovetails. Hope you enjoyed this. See you again.